Hey guys, it's Kaylee and welcome back to Hippie in a Suit, where every week I talk about sustainability because I dream of a world where we actually value all the amazing things nature gives us. For many of us, 2020 was the year that never was. So many of our big plans got derailed and our daily lives changed as we know them. But did you know that 2020 was also supposed to be an extremely important year for nature and nature events? So much so that the UN had actually dubbed it the super year for biodiversity because there were so many huge intergovernmental events and negotiations that were set to take place in 2020. Of course, COVID flipped everything upside down, and all of those events that were meant to take place were pushed into 2021. Not only that, 2021 also already had its own events that were scheduled to take place. So if you look at what was meant to be in 2020 and what was already planned for 2021, this year has huge potential to push the needle for nature. Now, I say potential because, of course, we know that sometimes these big global meetings of world leaders don't really result in much, but the potential is there, and this is why we as citizens need to keep pushing. So buckle up while I give you a lightning quick overview of all the big events that are set to take place in 2021 that could shape the future of nature as we know it. Let's go. All right, the first event I want to cover is actually one that's already happened. The United Nations Environment Assembly, or UNEA, happens every 2 years and is the meeting where all the countries who are a party to that particular assembly get together and work to advance environmental priorities and set the mandate for the UN Environment Program. This year, the meeting was held virtually on February 22nd to 23rd, and it was under the theme of strengthening actions for nature to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I was quite happy to see the number of substantive things that came out of this meeting, and specifically the UN Environment Program, or UN Environment, obtained approval for its medium-year strategy for 2022 to 2025, tongue twister. This strategy is quite ambitious and it covers a range of topics including climate change, resilience to disasters and conflict, healthy and productive ecosystems, environmental governance, chemicals, waste and air quality, resource efficiency, and a whole host of issues related to data and monitoring. From the conversations I've had so far with my friends and former colleagues at UN Environment, there's actually a lot of excitement around this strategy, and I've also been noticing that the UN Environment has been promoting their Making Peace with Nature synthesis report as well, which focuses on a slightly more pared down list of their overall strategy, specifically climate, biodiversity, and pollution. I don't know about you, but I've been getting a ton of ads from the UN Environment Program on YouTube, which makes me think that they're definitely very committed to pushing the needle on these issues. So I think that's a good sign, or maybe I'm just a nerd who only gets environmentally related ads on YouTube. The second event is the Conference for the Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. The CBD was signed in 1992 and has 3 objectives. The first is the conservation of biological diversity, duh. The second is the sustainable use of nature's components, and basically this is resource use. And the third is fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the use of those resources, which of course makes sense because nature is a common good, and so the benefits that arise should be distributed equitably. Unlike the climate COPs that happen every year, the CBD COPs actually happen every 2 years. And 2020, which is COP 15, was expected to be the equivalent to what the climate COP 21 in Paris was. In other words, we were expecting a sweeping global agreement that would protect nature, much like the Paris Agreement does for climate. Another reason there was a lot of anticipation around this 2020 event was because the Aichi targets were expiring. Now, what are those? Well, these were 20 biodiversity-related targets that were agreed to in 2010 and that came into effect for the period of 2011 to 2020. You might remember that in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the SDGs, there are indicators for tracking our progress. And for the biodiversity-related goals, the Aichi targets were what was actually used, because world leaders didn't want to create a new framework when there was already one that existed. But of course, what that means now is because they expired in 2020, we don't have anything to measure against for biodiversity-related goals. For this reason, the international community was really hoping that the 2020 COP would result in an updated framework. Also, and this was maybe one of the first times we'd seen this, China took a really strong diplomatic leadership position on this and wanted to advance this biodiversity agenda. But of course, they had to delay the meeting because of COVID-19, and the COP is now set to take place in Kunming, China on October 11th to 24th. But of course, we know things are still very much up in the air for these big, large events. The third event is one I have already talked about a little bit in my video about the US rejoining the Paris Agreement, but of course, the climate COP takes place every year, and the 2020 COP, COP26, was meant to be an extremely important meeting for the future of the agreement. This is because there were a couple of really big major issues that needed to get worked through to enable the agreement to become a reality. The first one is what I talked about in my last video, which is the ratcheting up of the ambition mechanism. So just to summarize, the ambition mechanism was put into place because at the time the agreement was signed in 2015, world leaders recognized that what they could commit to at that time would probably be different to what they could commit to in the future because of changing views on climate change, better technologies, etc. So the countries put in place a mechanism that would look at their contributions, and every 5 years they would hopefully up their ambition and commit to more reductions so that we can hopefully meet that 2 degrees C or better 1.5 degrees C that's in the agreement. Since the agreement was, as I said, negotiated in 2015, 2020 and COP26 was the first time we were supposed to look at these new commitments and hopefully agree to them. The second issue is that there's a section called Article 6 that has a number of really important issues around the operations of the agreement, namely carbon markets, which I'm sure you can imagine are extremely important because if you don't have a market mechanism or economic way to work together around carbon, how will we advance its reduction, as well as the funding of loss and damage, which again, another extremely important issue because we're experiencing more and more climate events globally. There needs to be some sort of way to pay for the funding of loss and damage. And finally, the climate finance issue was also on the table and was going to be reopened and readdressed at COP26 because frankly, we have not raised enough money for the Green Climate Fund. So yeah, a lot on the agenda. This is arguably the most important meeting for climate since COP21 in Paris, where the agreement was signed, and it is now scheduled to take place November 1st to 12th in Glasgow, Scotland, under the leadership of the United Kingdom. But I think the general consensus is that it's unlikely we'll be able to have a gathering of the size that the COPs usually are, and other options, namely online negotiations, are now being considered. However, this is tough because it puts us in a bit of a rock and a hard place. We can't really push the event because it would mean it would take longer to get those more ambitious targets, and it's more and more important that we have them because we're experiencing more and more effects of climate change. But at the same time, hosting an online negotiation is not a very viable option for developing countries who feel that they're disadvantaged in this negotiation format. You can imagine that developing countries, when they are on site, have the ability to pull aside some of the larger countries, get them in a room, catch them in the hallway. But in a Zoom format, that's a lot harder to do. Not to mention the fact that there are internet connectivity issues, time zone issues. I mean, there's such a host of problems when it comes to an online negotiation, especially for developing countries who are the most affected by climate change. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens with that one, but it's a tricky situation. And the final thing I wanted to bring to your attention is that there are 3 other big events that are taking place in 2021 that aren't exactly nature events, but they could have a big impact on nature. So just recently, there was a high-level meeting on water that took place on March 18th. There's going to be a high-level dialogue on energy that's going to take place on the sidelines of UNGA, the UN General Assembly, which happens every September. And there's a lot of buzz around this huge food system summit, which will take place sometime in the fall of 2021, although it hasn't yet been scheduled. One thing I find really interesting about these events, and this is just the nerd in me, I don't think this was deliberate, maybe it was, but if you look at the issues, food, water, and energy, they're often tackled in what we call a Nexus approach, which essentially looks at how these issues interact at a systems level. So if you think about these issues, they interact Actually a lot. So let's look at each system to give an example. So if you look at the food and water system, they both need energy to operate, whether that be the energy that goes into producing food, driving tractors, irrigation systems that need electricity to operate, or transporting it, getting it from one place to another, shipping it where it may need to be for export. The food system needs a lot of energy. And the water system is no different. You need energy to clean water, for example. And then if you look at the energy system can use water to produce energy. Think of hydroelectricity, for example, but not just hydro. Also, you have things like thermal energy, which is essentially energy produced from heat that needs steam in order to turn the turbines to create electricity. So you do need water often in energy production. And also sometimes if you look at the energy system, it actually competes with the food system for production. So if you look at things like biofuels, they can take growing space, which the agriculture or food system may need. And then of course, the water system is fundamental for producing food. You can't grow food without water. And as I mentioned, it sometimes can be used for producing energy as well. So all these issues interact with each other. And of course, they are also a part of nature. So I'll be very interested to see if these sessions happening in 2021 will also advance the nature agenda just because they're happening around the same time. I don't think they're necessarily focused on nature, although I have heard of nature-based solutions being brought up in a couple of these formats, but it's to be seen, and I think it could be quite an interesting constellation of events that are happening that hopefully will allow us to advance this very important agenda. All right, so that's it. That's my rapid fire on what to watch for the nature agenda in 2021. I hope you found it helpful. As always, I create a blog post with links to my research, additional resources where you can learn more, and 1 or 2 organizations you may choose to follow or support who work on this issue. If you learned something today, give this video a like. I appreciate it, and you big time. I will see you in the next one, and until then, keep fighting the good fight. Bye!